The last few days have not been great for Ukraine. Russia continues to advance in multiple areas all across the front, and they just struck 2 more airfields deep inside of Ukrainian territory. Fortunately, Ukraine is about to receive a new batch of military equipment from the United States. We'll run through what that list includes, as well as some key points from an interview yesterday with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. I'm going to start with a map view here to give you an idea of the areas we're talking about. 2 key areas today where Russia is advancing, although I should note, these are not the only places along the front where Russia is making progress. But today we're going to talk about Chasiv Yar and then New York, Ukraine. So looking at this map, deep state map, publicly available resource, the green is liberated territory that Ukraine has taken back from Russian forces. The red, or kind of light red here, is areas that Russia has taken since the invasion, full-scale invasion began in 2022. The more maroon area here, you'll see in the east in the Donbass and then south in Crimea. Those are territories taken by Russia in 2014. That's going to be important as we get into a couple of these here in a moment. Now, starting with Chasiv Yar, which is in the eastern portion of Ukraine, it's going to be just west of Bakhmut. If you remember that meat grinder of a battle that took place over the last couple of years. So Chasiv Yar is just here to the west of Bakhmut a little ways. Notable terrain because there's a canal that separates Chasiv Yar from some territory to the east. I'm going to turn to a satellite view to get a little better idea of what we're looking at here. This has been a focus of Russian forces for quite a while now. And according to War Gonzo, a Russian military blogger, he said the fighting here is increasingly shifting to the area of the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. And the canal is running through here, through the middle of town, kind of just to the east of Chasiv Yar. He says the Ukrainian armed forces have withdrawn from the eastern suburb of Chasiv Yar to previously prepared positions. And when he says eastern suburb of Chasiv Yar, it's this area right here. If we go back just a couple days, you'll see that this area was, at the start of the month, contested, right? And just here in the last couple days, that has now fallen completely under Russian control. In fact, I'll play a video here that was just released yesterday or the day before showing that Russian forces have captured an area in eastern Chasiv Yar where they say Ukrainian forces had holed up and were using this as a defensive position. It's just ruins, just rubble now. Right, and this is what we see in multiple areas as Russian forces move through. These frontline positions, these cities, these towns become the heart of the battle. And the buildings are just completely devastated. And we see that again here in the eastern portion of Chasiv Yar as that falls to Russian forces. Now, moving back to, should stay with Chasiv Yar for a second. A notable issue here is there's still this canal separating Russian forces. You can kind of see it on this map. Let's see if it's easier on the standard map view. Maybe. But you can see the canal separating Chasiv Yar here from where the Russian forces are in the east. That's going to be challenging to cross. It's not that big of a water feature, but it does restrict where Russian forces are able to move from east to west. So it wouldn't be shocking. Similar to what we saw in Bakhmut, where there is a canal in the eastern portion of the city, where Russian forces were kind of stopped along that front for a while and eventually over time kind of ground down the Ukrainian defenders and found other ways to the north and south around that canal to where they didn't have to necessarily cross it under fire. And then shifting over to the Russian advance in New York, I'm going to zoom back out to give you an idea again of where everything is taking place here. We were just looking, again, in the eastern portion of Ukraine. Chasiv Yar advance was here just west of Bakhmut. New York is a little ways south. It's this goofy-looking finger pointing out. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. But looking at 2 majors, a pro-Russian military blogger talking about what is playing out in this area right now. He says, significant successes of the Russian armed forces are celebrated in the Toretsk area. Our troops broke through the defenses of the Ukrainian armed forces near New York to a depth of 3 kilometers and occupied parts of Yuryevka. The Toretsk is almost continuously urbanized area, but despite this dense development, the surprise of individual maneuvers for the enemy caused the front line of the Ukrainian armed forces to crumble. The fighting continues. And something clearly happened here. I haven't heard at this point the argument from the Ukrainian armed forces, but if you look at how quickly this advanced, there you go, right? In a matter of days, on the 1st of July, there looked like no Russian forces advancing near New York, and you blink, and all of a sudden it's contested, taken very quickly. Now, a couple thoughts when looking at what we're seeing here around advancing towards New York. First, I would expect that this map is not completely updated. And even when you look at some pro-Russian maps right now, it's very similar where there's just a finger sticking out like this. That's not going to sustain for a couple different reasons, right? And there's a reason we don't see this throughout the rest of the war. Any Ukrainian forces in this pocket or this pocket are either going to risk being cut off if they're in small numbers, as Russian forces could kind of encircle around this, or if they are in strong numbers, they can cut off the Russian line, right? The Russian defensive lines on if you think about this, the east and western portion of this little advance here are not going to be heavily defended like at all, right? So if there's stronger Ukrainian forces to the east or the west, they're going to be able to quickly sever this. If there are not, then they run the risk, again, of being surrounded one way or the other. So I think this little finger that we see here is going to be very short term. I would expect in the next day or two this to either go away if the Ukrainian forces are stronger in the area or the numbers are stronger in the area, or for these pockets, especially to the east here, to turn under Russian control and for Ukrainian forces to evacuate. Now, at the beginning of this video, I went over the different colors of the map, talking about how this kind of light red area, we'll call it, is territory taken by Russia since the 2022 full-scale invasion began, whereas this purple area is what they took in 2014. Look at where this advance in New York is taking place, right? This is right along some of these areas that have been somewhat defended for 10 years now. And that's what I think is notable when looking over these couple different advances from Russia. The key here, both at New York, west of Avdiivka, where Russia continues to take territory, a little further north here, if we go back a couple days as well, you'll also see an advance by Russian forces. Clicking through just a little bit there, but west of Avdiivka, Chasiv Yar, all of these areas where Russia continues to move forward, the key isn't necessarily territory gained. And we'll see a map. War Mapper does a great job where they show how little, realistically, month after month, Russia continues to take of Ukrainian territory. That's not really the bigger picture here. The bigger question at this point is what comes with that territory. So it's men, equipment, and defensive positions, all of which are in short supply. So it is entirely possible that somewhere along the front, we have to keep this in mind, we have to consider it, that Russia could take small gain after small gain after small gain, and eventually that all adds up to something significant and the entire front collapses. That is possible. It seems unlikely at this point because we haven't really seen that happen at all. It also seems unlikely at this point that if it did happen, Russia would be able to take advantage and rapidly break through with a battalion, brigade, division size element. We just haven't seen them really have the force in mass to be able to exploit a scenario like that. The bigger challenge here, I would argue, with any little change of territory is that the defensive lines have to shift further and further back. So, of course, I just went away from the map, and now I'm going to talk to the map. So if we look at Chasiv Yar, for instance, the defensive lines were east here around Bakhmut, even further east for a long time, right? And as Russia has pushed forward, Ukraine has had to move those defensive lines back. And it is expected that the priority is going towards the front where the fighting is actually taking place. So if we look at Chasiv Yar right now, you could expect that the majority of men and equipment and defensive constructed positions are going to be somewhere where they can engage Russian forces. It wouldn't make sense right now, while they're holding Chasiv Yar, to start building up significantly 10, 15, 20 kilometers to the west. So what that means is when any one of these areas fall, even when we're just talking about this eastern suburb portion of Chasiv Yar, get this out of the way. So even just this little area here, they just fell to Russian forces a few days ago. For a period of time, Ukraine was spending significant resources, all things considered, men, equipment, and defensive positions to hold that area. That's gone now. No, not clear how many lives it costs, not clear how much equipment it costs, but that defensive position is gone. All the resources poured into that are out the window. Now they have to shift further back. In this type of war of attrition that we're seeing play out between Russia and Ukraine, that is very, very important. How much manpower and equipment Russia is going to expend to take every kilometer, every 100 meters is very, very important for Ukraine. So every piece of territory that they lose risks, a declining value in those defensive positions. Again, down by New York here, these are areas that Ukraine likely has been building up defensive structures. It's like what we saw at Avdiivka for 10 years now. So when those fall, how solid are the defensive structures behind that, right? It's something we really have to consider when looking at these Russian advances. Again, they're for the most part, relatively minor all across the front. That New York advance was surprising, about 3 kilometers in a day. It's little movements, but those little movements do add up to something larger in the long term. You can't write them off completely. Now, we did get news yesterday that Russia just struck a third airfield, pretty far behind the front lines. So we first talked about in a video a couple days ago the Mirgorod airfield. Then there was Poltava, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And then Dolgintsevo, which I know I'm not pronouncing right. Dolgintsevo. It's a tough one. Sorry. But we're going to pull that up and look at where each one of these locations are as it relates to the broader war. So the couple of videos, actually, Russia released here as well, which, of course, raises the question, how are they having drone coverage that closely monitoring some of these sensitive sites over Ukraine? The first one here is, let's see, the first one is Poltava. This took place a couple days ago. I'll play the video here. They say that they targeted an Mi-24 helicopter and an airfield with equipment, and that Poltava airfield is approximately 115 kilometers from the front. Now, a couple notes while we're looking at both of these is I have heard people say that both of these airfields are either fake, like they're old spare parts, or they're intended to be decoys or something like that. I haven't seen any evidence from that, and looking at these two clips, or these 3 clips, really, that doesn't pass the common sense test for me. It could be, and maybe I'm being fooled, but Ukraine has a shortage of air platforms, which means they have a shortage of spare parts. So it's hard to imagine that they would sacrifice any aircraft or helicopter at all and put it out where Russia could see it in the hopes that Russia strikes it, because the intelligence gathered from that is very, very minimal. Right? We already know that Russia has a lot of Iskanders and cruise missiles and things to conduct deep strikes inside of Ukraine. We already know that. So what are you gaining from that? Also, those missiles are likely able to launch and then relocate. So we're not going to be able to Ukraine's not going to be able to conduct a counterstrike mission in a short period of time. So there's not a lot of benefit. And what are you going to sacrifice an old air platform for a missile? That's not a one-to-one trade that Ukraine's going to want to make. So it's not entirely clear why they would be sacrificing old aircraft when some components from those old aircraft could still be used to keep current platforms in the sky. Now, starting with the Poltava airfield, we're going to take a look here into where that strike took place. So again, starting zoomed out with Ukraine, moving in, just have to zoom in a little bit and we start to see it. Just west of Kharkiv here is where that first video took place, the strike at the Poltava airfield. The second one here took place, again, apologies on the pronunciation, Dolgintsevo. According to Russian Telegram channels that released this footage, they say another Iskander carried out a strike targeting a MiG-29 as well as the aircraft weapons and the aviation engineering service vehicles, and then the handful of personnel on that airfield. One noticeable thing in the second video is it does look like we're starting to see some kind of modified overhead cover to try to protect these aircraft from strikes just like this. In previous videos, just a couple days ago, we were not seeing this at all, and it was being called out on both Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels saying, wait a minute, why are their aircraft sitting out open, exposed to these cluster munitions? It's a criticism that Russian mill bloggers have had for a long time, and when they saw the same thing playing out in Ukraine, we then saw the Russians say, hey, look, they're just like us. They're making the same mistakes we are, and then some sources inside of Ukraine making that same argument. Now, pulling up a map here as well to show where this second strike took place. This one's a little bit closer, about 80 kilometers from the front. So starting zoomed out all of Ukraine, we're going to head a little bit south here. This second video took place in this area here. So that's, if the strike came from the Kherson region, roughly 80 kilometers behind the front lines. But either way, all of these are notable strikes for a couple key reasons. F-16s are getting ready to arrive in Ukraine sometime in the next month or two, right? It's kind of up in the air. And Russia continues to show an ability to constantly target airfields deep inside of Ukrainian territory. It's not clear that ability ever went away, but they certainly prioritized other targets for periods of time. Right now, they're showing day in and day out that they can not only strike these Ukrainian airfields, but they can record it, appear to have good effects on target, and then do it again the next day. That's a problem. Where is Ukraine going to put these F-16s to where they can still impact the battle if every one of these airfields is either the aircraft are being destroyed on the tarmac, or another big question that's not as easy to show as, say, aircraft being destroyed, but when those runways are cratered. What if those runways are cratered every other day for a month? That could very easily ground all of the aircraft there. And the F-16s wouldn't be able to function even when they arrive in country, wouldn't be able to get up in the skies. Now, the way to mitigate this for Ukraine, because again, these missiles can be launched from just about anywhere. Of course, you could try to shoot the drones down. That wouldn't be a bad thing. If they knew they were there and had the ability to down them, it's going to turn to air defense. And this is a challenge, of course, because air defense has Ukraine has a limited number of air defense platforms across the country. These airfields are likely going to need to be viewed as a high priority target that they're going to need to defend to shift something like multiple NASAMS, a Patriot, something to these different airfields to be able to intercept these munitions when they're inbound. Ukraine doesn't have a lot of air defense assets. It's one of the most requested items that they have, and they're expensive, and the West doesn't. We don't have a lot to give, right? So it's a real challenge that Ukraine's going to have to figure out how to allocate those air defense assets to protect their airfields going forward. Now, there's also the possibility of using decoys. Saw this image pop up earlier today on a pro-Russian Telegram channel. From a distance, that thing looks an awful lot like an F-16. It's probably going to eat up an Iskander or something else. These decoys are getting crazy. Now, turning to some positive news for Ukraine here. The U.S. just announced a new aid package totaling $2.3 billion in total. That's between the Presidential Drawdown Authority and the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative Fund. So a couple different programs to help arm Ukraine. They said in this announcement, according to the Pentagon, that it'll be used to purchase interceptors for the Patriot and NASAMS air defense systems for Ukraine, as well as missiles for the Hawk air defense systems, rockets for the HIMARS and M270 MLRS, artillery, mortars, anti-tank missiles, tactical vehicles, and aircraft support equipment. There are also rumors recently that more Patriots might be headed to Ukraine, including one possibly from Israel. We'll see. Again, air defense is a major, major concern in Ukraine. So the positive news here from the recent announcements is, at the very least, a lot more interceptors for the systems they already have on ground. Now, along with this announcement came an updated U.S. aid to Ukraine fact sheet dated 3 July 2024. And I wanted to pull this up to talk through just the quantity of some of these munitions that have headed over, because I think this flies under the radar at some point. We're just so used to these shipments going over, and you realize just how many of some of these things are in country being used to fight back against Russian forces. Running through this list, and it's a lot here. More than 40 HIMARS, the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System. I feel like the last time I saw that, it was somewhere in the 30s. It seems like that number just kind of keeps ticking upwards. Now, we have seen a couple destroyed by Russia at this point, too, maybe 3. The claims of about 90 destroyed, right? But it does seem like the U.S. keeps kind of sliding more HIMARS in there day in and day out. And, of course, worth noting, a single HIMARS can fire 1 ATACMS at a time or 6 rockets. So it's a lot of firepower those things can put out. More than 300 Bradleys. I thought this was interesting because we continue to see footage of, and Russia really brags about anytime they're able to destroy or disable a Bradley. More than 300 have arrived in Ukraine already. That's a lot of firepower. More than 600 Mike 113 armored personnel carriers. Again, this is any piece of U.S. equipment, any piece of Western equipment, really, Russia likes to highlight when they're destroyed or damaged. 600 113s is a lot of 113s. More than 1,000 MRAPs, more than 3,000 Humvees. 3,000 Humvees floating around Ukraine at this point. And then 10,000 Javelins and 9,000 TOW missiles. That is a lot. I knew these numbers were big. I haven't checked in on the exact numbers in quite a while. But a lot of these, they don't give the specifics. They'll just say, like, we sent, more of this type of UAV without giving a number or whatever it might be. But when they get into like 10,000 Javelins, 9,000 TOWs, that's a lot of possible tanks being blown up in Ukraine. Then wrapping up here with a recent interview yesterday, actually, on Bloomberg with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, where he kind of pushed back on some recent statements from Trump, but did have some optimism about how this war could end. He said, quote, "If Trump knows how to finish this war, he should tell us today. If there are risks to Ukrainian independence, if we lose statehood, we want to be ready for this. We want to know." And what he's pushing back on there is often, he's brought it up in the most recent debate, but a regular point coming from Trump is that he knows how to end this war, and he will end the war in Ukraine before he even enters office. Kind of suggesting like he just has to say the words and it'll be over. And we've talked about that a little bit before on this channel just because it's come up in press statements. Sure would be nice, and I would argue it's borderline immoral if somebody has the solution to end the war and is just sitting on it and waiting until they get into a position of power. My gut says that that's probably not exactly how it would play out. Maybe he has some ideas, but it's hard to imagine that there's one person anywhere in the world right now, outside of Putin, really, who could make the decision to end the war today. Now, pushing back on some more items here, talking about whether or not Ukraine was actually in a deadlock. Zelensky said, quote, "It's not a deadlock. It's a problematic situation. A deadlock means there's no way out. But a problem can be solved if one has the will and has the tools. We do have the will and the tools. They just haven't arrived yet." So kind of focusing on, again, hey, give us what we need. We're ready to fight. We will win this war. Kind of a solid message we continue to hear from Zelensky. He hasn't really wavered in that messaging. He did note that Ukrainian forces are currently better positioned in terms of manpower than they were a few months ago, and that the new counteroffensive is dependent on arming the brigades. So a couple thoughts there. There was some mobilization pushed forward in Ukraine in the last few months, so it's not shocking to hear that they're better in terms of manpower. Again, that information tends to be relatively close held, so we don't get the details on what exactly does that mean. How many more troops do you have in uniform at this point? This is some of the first information I've heard about a counteroffensive being planned. Right now, I'm not sure that Ukraine has the manpower or the equipment. As much as they want to push Russia out of some of these occupied territories, based off what we saw last summer and how well Russia had dug in some of these locations, and lack of air power, it's hard to envision right now what a successful counteroffensive would look like. But of course, if you're Ukraine, you have to keep that in mind. You have to think of what that will be when the actual time comes. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. I'll put a couple articles down there related to what we're talking about in the video today if you want to check those out. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.